If you can't have some standard of treatment for treatment of Americans in the U.S., I mean, how can you possibly expect people around the world and third world countries to be treated well, you know?
For over half a century, Donald Fagen shaped Steely Dan into a fortress of perfection, layered, brilliant, and untouchable. Every lyric sharpened like glass, every song a labyrinth of sound and sarcasm. Yet behind the clever lines and studio walls was a silence louder than any note. A silence no interview uncovered, no critic could penetrate. Until now. At 77, the man who defined cool no longer hides. What he reveals about his life is not triumph, not legend. It's sadness, a decline that strips away the myth and leaves only a fragile human truth. But how did one of music's sharpest minds reach a life so far from the brilliance he created? Donald Fagen never wanted the spotlight. That's the first contradiction of his story. The man who became the voice and face of Steely Dan was, at his core, a deeply private, often reluctant figure. Born in Passaic, New Jersey, in 1948, Fagen grew up in a world far from glamorous. His childhood was marked by suburban monotony, a yearning for escape, and a relentless obsession with jazz and literature. He devoured the sounds of Duke Ellington and Miles Davis, while simultaneously burying himself in the novels of Kafka and Nabokov. Music was never just entertainment for him, it was an intellectual pursuit, a puzzle to solve, a language in which he could finally say the things he couldn't articulate in ordinary conversation. At Bard College in the late 1960s, fate intervened when he crossed paths with Walter Becker. Two outsiders, both cynical and razor-sharp, they recognized in each other a rare kind of brilliance. Together, they built a musical partnership that would redefine American rock. But what made them unique also made them unapproachable. Their songs were laced with biting irony, complex jazz harmonies, and lyrics that painted seedy portraits of broken dreams and twisted desires. This wasn't music for the masses. It was music for those willing to peer into the shadows of modern life. Their early years were marked by frustration. Fagen, painfully shy and uncomfortable as a frontman, struggled with live performances. He preferred the studio, where he could agonize over every chord and syllable, perfecting Steely Dan's unique sound. Yet despite his reluctance, the band surged into prominence in the 1970s. Hits like Reelin' in the Years, Ricky Don't Lose That Number, and Peg made them unlikely rock stars, though Fagen often recoiled from the very fame they generated. What the public didn't see was the toll this contradiction was taking. Donald Fagen was brilliant, but he was also fragile. The pressure to perform, to create masterpieces on command, left him constantly teetering between triumph and breakdown. While his peers reveled in the excess of the rock scene, Fagen withdrew, an introvert trapped in the role of reluctant icon. Behind the sharp wit of his lyrics was a man who often struggled to leave his apartment.
To do something different with the music, and on the other hand, we want to respect the spirit of the music.
Who felt more at home in fiction and sound than in the messy reality of life. That fragility would follow him for decades, even as Steely Dan became one of the most respected bands of all time. But back in those early years, before the Grammys, before the reunions, before the solitude that would define his later life, Donald Fagen stood on the edge of greatness, a genius who didn't want to be seen, pushed into the spotlight by a fate he never asked for. And though it made him legendary, it also set the stage for the sadness that would follow. By the mid-1970s, Steely Dan had transformed from an obscure studio project into one of the most enigmatic and revered acts in American music. But their rise was anything but typical. While most bands lived for the stage, Fagen and Becker despised touring. They abandoned the road altogether in 1974, choosing instead to retreat into the studio, where they could obsess over every note without the distraction of adoring fans or grueling travel schedules. This decision set Steely Dan apart. Their albums became monuments to perfectionism, crafted with layers of session musicians, polished endlessly until each track gleamed like glass. Albums like Katie Lied, The Royal Scam, and Aja weren't just successful, they were revolutionary. blending jazz sophistication with rock accessibility in a way no one had done before. Critics hailed them as geniuses, musicians envied their precision, and audiences, though often mystified by their cryptic lyrics, couldn't resist the slick, hypnotic grooves. But the golden years weren't golden for Fagen himself. While Becker spiraled into drug addiction, Fagen retreated deeper into his shell. The studio became his sanctuary and his prison. He would spend 12-hour days agonizing over a single guitar solo, discarding take after take until only perfection remained. He pushed musicians to their breaking point, demanding they capture the exact sound he heard in his head. To outsiders, it looked like brilliance. To those closest to him, it was obsession, bordering on madness. Success brought money, awards, and critical acclaim, but it did not bring happiness. Fagen was uncomfortable with fame, uncomfortable with interviews, uncomfortable even with fans. He rarely attended industry parties, preferring to disappear into the quiet corners of New York City, where anonymity was easier to maintain. And yet, despite his discomfort, the world demanded more. By the late 1970s, Steely Dan was at the peak of its powers, and Donald Fagen, whether he liked it or not, was one of the defining voices of his generation. In 1980, Gaucho was released after years of delays, lawsuits, and personal turmoil. It was another masterpiece, but its creation nearly destroyed Fagen. The record's exhausting production process symbolized the darker side of his genius. Brilliance born from endless struggle. Music forged in anxiety and exhaustion. Shortly after, Steely Dan quietly dissolved. Fagen, finally free from the crushing demands of the band, thought he would find peace. Instead, he discovered something worse: emptiness. The golden years of Steely Dan were built on contradictions. Unprecedented success paired with deep personal dissatisfaction. For Donald Fagen, the music was flawless, but life behind it was anything but. And as the spotlight dimmed, he would soon find that without Becker, without the cocoon of Steely Dan, he was utterly adrift. In the years after Steely Dan's dissolution, Donald Fagen slipped into a life that could only be described as lonely chaos. While fans assumed he was basking in the quiet rewards of success, the reality was much darker. Depression had long stalked him, and without the constant push of collaboration, he spiraled deeper into its grip. Fagen released his first solo album, The Nightfly, in 1982, a brilliant autobiographical work that critics hailed as a masterpiece.
I'm Lester the Nightfly, hello Baton Rouge.
It earned him Grammy nominations and cemented his reputation as one of the greatest songwriters of his time. But even as the accolades poured in, Fagen admitted he felt no joy. Success was hollow. The meticulous crafting of music, once his salvation, now felt like a burden. Behind closed doors, his personal life was unraveling. Friends described him as reclusive, prone to long bouts of isolation. He struggled with anxiety and paranoia, often convinced that others were trying to exploit him. Romantic relationships came and went, each one strained by his inability to connect or trust. He masked his pain with sarcasm, with wit, with the same biting irony that colored his lyrics. But those closest to him saw the cracks. Worse still, he began to resent the very thing that had given him purpose: music. Each new project felt like a battle he couldn't win, a reminder of the impossibly high standard he had set for himself. While contemporaries toured the world, basking in adoration, Fagen recoiled from the stage. The very act of performing left him drained, exposed, vulnerable. He could write songs about the emptiness of modern life, but he couldn't escape living it. By the late 1980s, Donald Fagen was a man adrift, rich, respected, yet profoundly unhappy. He had achieved everything artists dream of, but it had brought him nothing but isolation. Even when Steely Dan reunited in the early 1990s, even when the band won Grammys again, even when audiences around the world cheered his name, Fagen remained haunted by the same battles he had faced since childhood. The genius was undeniable. The sadness was unavoidable. Donald Fagen, the reluctant star, had built a legacy that millions admired, but he could never build a life in which he himself felt whole. And as the years passed, the weight of those personal battles only grew heavier. For all his genius, Donald Fagen never managed to fully reconcile his personal life with his artistic one. Romantic relationships often ended in heartbreak, not because he was incapable of love, but because he carried a fortress of solitude around him. Those close to him described him as alternately brilliant and impossible, capable of profound tenderness one moment, then coldly distant the next. He wanted intimacy, but the spotlight, his perfectionism, and his lifelong battle with depression made it difficult for anyone to truly get close. He married Libby Titus in the early 1990s, a singer and songwriter herself, and for a while, it seemed like stability might finally enter his life. But the shadows never truly lifted. Their marriage was complicated, filled with long stretches of detachment, and haunted by Fagen's lifelong inability to settle into domestic comfort. Friends recalled that he often seemed happiest when lost in the safety of his studio, tinkering endlessly with chords and arrangements rather than engaging in the messy unpredictability of human connection. Fagen's struggle wasn't just personal. It was magnified by the strange weight of fame. Unlike many rock stars, he didn't bask in it. He despised celebrity culture, recoiled from interviews, and often bristled when fans invaded his space. To him, the public image of Donald Fagen, the cool, intellectual voice of Steely Dan, was a mask, and behind it was a man who often felt fragile and unseen. Even his friendships were fraught. Walter Becker, his lifelong collaborator, was both his anchor and his mirror. Together they created timeless music, but their relationship was far from easy. Becker's struggles with addiction and Fagen's emotional distance strained them, sometimes to the breaking point. Yet, despite everything, they remained tethered by their art. When Becker passed away in 2017, Fagen's grief was palpable. He didn't just lose a partner. He lost the one person who truly understood the strange, dark brilliance of his inner world. The story of Fagen's personal life is not one of wild excess or public scandal, but of quiet heartbreak and solitude. He wasn't destroyed by drugs, or money, or reckless living. His tragedy was more subtle. A man who could write songs that pierced the soul, yet often found himself unable to connect in the ways he most longed for. Fame amplified the isolation rather than curing it, leaving him perpetually caught between love and loss, genius and despair. If there is one trait that defined Donald Fagen's career, it was his obsession with perfection. From the earliest days of Steely Dan, he and Becker were notorious for pushing musicians to extremes, recording take after take until the sound matched the one in their heads. Some guitarists recalled spending days in the studio only to discover that their contributions had been erased and replaced by another session player. For Fagen, it wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Music wasn't finished until it was flawless. But perfectionism comes at a cost. For Fagen, it meant a constant war with himself. He could never fully enjoy success because in his mind, there was always something left undone, something that could have been sharper, tighter, better. Even Aja, hailed as a masterpiece, was to him a compromise, an almost rather than an absolute.
Up on the hill, people never stand.
This relentless pursuit of the unattainable left him drained, suspicious of praise, and perpetually dissatisfied. It also alienated those who worked with him. Musicians admired his genius, but many dreaded the grueling process of recording with him. Some never forgave the coldness with which their work was discarded. Fagen was not intentionally cruel, but his perfectionism often made him appear unfeeling, prioritizing the music above the human beings making it. To him, art was sacred, and people, himself included, were merely vessels to serve it. This weight of perfectionism also infected his personal life. He was never able to fully switch it off, always scrutinizing, always measuring. Even moments of joy were fleeting, because his mind was already cataloging what was imperfect about them. He envied those who could live messily, who could embrace flaws. He could write about imperfection with devastating clarity, but he couldn't inhabit it without discomfort. In the end, perfectionism gave the world Steely Dan's flawless sound, but it also gave Fagen a life filled with unease. His genius was undeniable, but it was a prison of his own making, every note perfected at the cost of peace of mind. As Donald Fagen entered the later years of his life, he found himself both celebrated and haunted by the legacy he had built. Steely Dan's reunion tours in the 1990s and 2000s proved that their music hadn't aged. It had only grown in stature. Fans packed arenas to hear the songs that once defined their youth, and critics hailed the duo's ability to remain sharp and relevant decades after their peak. Yet for Fagen, the spotlight still felt uncomfortable. He often performed with sunglasses on, shielding himself from both the lights and the gaze of the audience. The death of Walter Becker in 2017 marked a turning point. Steely Dan, for all intents and purposes, was over. Though Fagen continued to tour under the band's name, he admitted that it would never be the same. Becker had been more than a partner. He was the only one who could shoulder the burden of genius alongside him. Without him, Fagen carried the weight alone, and the loneliness deepened. In interviews, Fagen's tone grew more reflective, sometimes even bitter. He lamented the state of modern music, the decline of craftsmanship, the rise of disposable pop. To him, the world no longer valued the painstaking artistry that had defined his life. And yet, even in his bitterness, there was a sense of reluctant acceptance. He had created music that would outlive him. That was his legacy, even if his personal life remained unresolved. The twilight years of Donald Fagen are a portrait of contradiction. He is celebrated as a legend, but often feels misunderstood. He continues to tour, to play, to sing the songs that once made him a reluctant star. But behind the sunglasses, the same sadness lingers. For Fagen, the applause has always been distant, the spotlight always too bright, the love of fans both a comfort and a reminder of the solitude he cannot escape. And yet, for all his struggles, one truth remains. Donald Fagen gave the world a soundtrack unlike any other. His twilight years may be shadowed by loneliness and regret, but his music ensures that he will never truly fade. The man may have been fragile, but the songs are immortal. Donald Fagen's life offstage has been a quiet graveyard of relationships, friendships, and bonds that couldn't withstand the weight of his contradictions. Those who knew him describe him as a man who craved intimacy but recoiled from it once it got too close. He had partners who adored his brilliance but could not endure his silences, his relentless mood swings, or his tendency to retreat into music as a shield against real vulnerability. His marriage to Libby Titus, a talented singer and songwriter, should have been a haven. Instead, it became another battlefield of distance and disconnection. Though they shared creativity and mutual respect, they lived in separate emotional worlds. For Fagen, the guitar and piano were safer companions than people. Predictable, obedient, never asking for more than he was willing to give. And so, the relationship unraveled. Friendships, too, were fleeting.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to thank Naris, and I'd like to thank Jerry and Ellie for getting me that piano.
Musicians who once admired him often found themselves pushed aside after conflicts in the studio or tours marred by his perfectionism. His partnership with Walter Becker endured not because it was easy, but because both men shared the same sharp edges, the same distrust of sentimentality. With Becker gone, Fagen's circle grew smaller, his solitude more complete. The collapse of these connections was not always dramatic. Often it was quieter, a drifting away, a phone call unanswered, a door closed one final time. Yet the result was the same, a man surrounded by music, but starved of human closeness. Fagen, who had written some of the most acutely observant songs about the complexities of human behavior, could never fully master those complexities in his own life. The tragedy of his relationships is not in their end, but in the pattern. Love offered, love withdrawn, and finally, love lost. In his later years, Fagen began to face the unrelenting truth of time. The once ironclad control of his voice faltered, his energy on stage diminished, and his body began to betray the sharpness of the mind inside it. Though not one to discuss health openly, whispers of illness circulated, stories of hospital visits, canceled shows, and moments when he simply looked too frail to carry the weight of his music. Age, for someone like Fagen, was not merely physical decline. It was a cruel mirror, forcing him to confront imperfection in a body and a life he had tried to control with ruthless precision. To be mortal was, for him, a form of humiliation. The man who once dissected every note, every lyric, now had to accept missed chords, weaker breath, and fatigue he could not outthink or outwork. Worse still, the death of Walter Becker intensified the fragility. With Becker gone, Fagen had no partner to lean on, no equal to share the stage with. He was left carrying Steely Dan's name like a banner he no longer wanted to wave.
I mean, as I say, we had this other book of pop tunes, so it was already dumbed down in the beginning.
Touring became less about joy and more about obligation. Contracts signed, fans expecting to hear the classics, while the man playing them longed for silence. Illness and age did not merely weaken Donald Fagen. They stripped away the last illusions he had about control. He could no longer perfect his music or his image. He could no longer outpace the loneliness. And in that loss, his life became smaller, sadder, and painfully human. These days, Donald Fagen's life is a stark contrast to the world he once commanded. At 77, he lives quietly, often in solitude, in a routine that feels less like living and more like enduring. He wakes late, sometimes skipping meals, and drifts between the piano and old recordings. The house around him is cluttered with instruments, sheet music, and relics of a career that once shook the world, but now feels like a museum curated by the man who can't escape it. He still tours on occasion, but between shows, his world shrinks to silence. Friends are few, visitors rarer still. Those close to him say he spends hours replaying old jazz records, smoking, and writing fragments of songs that never reach completion. The man who once filled arenas with dazzling, precise compositions now sits in near isolation, his genius unused, his audience forgotten. Financially, he is secure. Steely Dan royalties and touring revenue ensure that, but money has never been the answer to his emptiness. Wealth cannot banish the loneliness of long evenings spent staring at unfinished lyrics. Fame cannot bring back the lost companionship of Becker or the relationships that drifted into memory. It is the routine of a man untethered, writing music no one may hear, replaying the same old records, living among ghosts of a past that was brilliant but never happy. The tragedy of Donald Fagen's present is not poverty, scandal, or disgrace. It is silence. Silence in the life of a man who gave sound to so many. At 77, Donald Fagen stands as a paradox. His music is immortal, etched into the cultural memory of generations. Reelin' in the Years, Do It Again, Deacon Blues. These songs remain alive, vibrant, unaging, but the man behind them has grown old, weary, and painfully alone.
I still write on the piano, and Walter would come over with a guitar or a bass.
The sadness of his life is not in any dramatic downfall, but in the slow erosion of joy. He was never built for fame, never comfortable with adoration, never able to reconcile his genius with his humanity. Every triumph was shadowed by self-doubt. Every love story ended in distance. Every success measured against a standard only he could see, and only he could fail. With Walter Becker gone, with health failing, and with the world moving on, Donald Fagen now lives in a strange half-light, celebrated by fans, but forgotten in spirit. His home is filled with music, but his heart is filled with silence. His songs will outlive him, but the man himself, tired, bitter, and alone, lives a life that feels tragically small compared to the legend his name carries. And that is the final irony of Donald Fagen's story. The man who dissected human loneliness in song became its most haunting example. At 77, his life is not marked by scandal, excess, or ruin. It is marked by emptiness, and sometimes that is the saddest ending of all. If genius can build walls strong enough to protect a legend, why can't it protect the man himself? At 77, Donald Fagen's life tells a story far less glamorous than the music he gave the world. Perhaps sadness, too, deserves to be heard, if only to remind us that brilliance doesn't shield us from being human. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.